What if holiness were the safest mask a monster could wear? Imagine a room of candles and ledgers, men in black robes with soft voices, and the faint scrape of quills recording something that sounds like prayer, but is really the arithmetic of pain. Not a dungeon in the shadows, not bandits in an alley. A courtroom, a chapel, a file room. The most organized cruelty in early modern Europe running on parchment, seals, and signatures. This is the Spanish Inquisition, a machine that called torture a sacrament and discipline a path to salvation. For more than 3 centuries, roughly 1478 to 1834, its tribunals spread across cities and colonies, whispering the same promise. Suffering could become holy if you assigned it an inventory number. We are taught to remember horror as chaos, torches, mobs, blind rage. But what lived behind these doors was the opposite order. Every scream had a line in the ledger. Every broken joint had a heading. Confessions, whether whispered or sobbed, were bundled into neat folios and shelved under saints' names. What terrifies isn't merely what was done, but how calmly, predictably, and repeatedly it was done. There were manuals, how-to guides for pain. There were audits to ensure uniformity from Seville to Toledo. In a world of uncertainties, the Inquisition's suffering was standardized, a repeatable procedure like a craft learned in a guild. They did not invent torture. They perfected its administration. The difference matters. A knife in a back alley is a crime. A knife after a prayer, witnessed by a notary, is policy. Here, violence secured legitimacy by passing through sacred language and legal form. The men who presided were not caricatures of madness. They were educated clerics and jurists who believed they were rescuing souls from error, pruning a vineyard gone wild. If pain could bring confession and confession could cleanse, then the apparatus of agony could be sold to conscience as a mercy. That was the spell, and it worked. The story you are about to enter is not a cabinet of medieval torture devices, though the devices are real and their names still sting: garrucha, patro, the cloth and water that taught people to fear their own breath. It is rather the biography of a system, how a set of offices, salaries, rubrics, and rituals converted ordinary men into steady instruments of suffering, and ordinary towns into theaters of obedience. The Inquisition did not merely break bodies, it rearranged communities. It taught neighbors to accuse, markets to shun, children to testify, priests to bless, kings to profit, and scribes to translate shrieks into scripture-like text. Begin where the logic felt most unassailable, with God. The Inquisition wrapped itself in canon law and papal approval, presenting its tribunals as caretakers of belief in a country anxious about unity. In the late 15th century, after centuries of Reconquista warfare, and amid a fragile project of national consolidation, religious sameness was advertised as a kind of public hygiene. Those who stood outside it, or even looked like they might, became the subject of pastoral concern sharpened into steel. A confession, once extracted, could be reported as a triumph of grace. An execution could be relabeled as the state's reluctant cooperation with heaven's justice. The vocabulary distanced the hand from the hurt. The early victims were often conversos and moriscos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity and were suspected of still practicing older rites in secret. This suspicion had no natural endpoint. Its circle was closed. Deny, and your denial proved craftiness. Confess, and your confession proved the charge. Either way, the procedure had work to do. You could not reason your way out of an accusation. You could only pass through it, like a gate whose hinges were already oiled. But if the heart of the Inquisition was theology, its body was bureaucracy. Consider the image we so rarely dwell on, the table. On it, ink pots, seals, a rosary, a sand shaker to dry the page. Behind it, an inquisitor dictating to a clerk whose pen does not pause even when the prisoner's breath does. The clerk's duty is not outrage but accuracy. Names spelled correctly, times noted, the exact point in an interrogation when a voice broke. The neutrality of the record became its camouflage. Years later, when readers scanned those lines, applied the question, produced abundant tears, admitted error, the horror stood invisible behind the courteous Latin. The file made cruelty look like administration. We are tempted to think that only sadists could do this work. It is safer to believe that. Yet the architecture of institutional evil does not require villains in every chair. It requires roles that detach outcomes from intentions. Train a novice to call a scream resistance. Call a dislocation a sign of grace at work. Call a strangling before burning mercy. And you can make almost anyone diligent at their desk. Add incentives, promotion for productive interrogations, exile for laxity, and a culture emerges where the hardest-hearted thrive and the tender learn to be quiet or leave. Outside, the city learned its part. There were processions and public penance, San Benitos painted with flames and demons, hats rising like accusations above a sea of heads. On feast days, platforms were built where judgments read like sermons and sentences like liturgies. Families came as to a fair. Vendors sold food within smelling distance of human smoke. A people that prayed together could be taught to watch together, and to speak to their children of the day they saw sin purified in fire. It is the ordinariness that numbs, the way a spectacle fuses with a calendar until nobody remembers when it felt strange. Inside, the tools were not always crude. A rope through a ceiling block could become a metronome of despair. A cloth and a jug could teach a body to panic on command. A rack could be tuned as finely as a musician tunes a lute, each turn producing a documented interval of pain. The manuals required that garments be loosened to monitor tremors, that pauses be inserted to cultivate hope, that water be poured at temperatures most likely to activate terror rather than shock. No theater director marks beats more carefully than an inquisitor eager for a fruitful session. And after each session, the record. The scribe notes the time at which the accused began to cooperate, who among the onlookers admonished with charity, whether the penitent persisted in obstinacy or returned to the fold. In these clipped phrases we meet a second violence, the reduction of a life into proofs. A woman whose shoulder will never lift a child again becomes disposed to confess. A man who will wake for years at the sound of water becomes a soul delivered from error. Language is the final device smoothing splinters from the plank that held a body down. Perhaps most chilling is how well it functioned. The Inquisition produced what it promised: confessions, reconciliations, purges, the sensation of safety. It replaced the messy unpredictability of rumor with the clean certainty of verdicts. It offered rulers a ledger of loyalty and God a ledger of repentance. The price was paid in breath and bone and in the slow bleaching of a culture's capacity for pity. When pain is counted as a cost of order, most citizens will learn to live with it. After all, the papers are in order, the seals impressed, the prayers said. What remains to protest? You will meet names in what follows: Gonzalez, Fernandez, Santos, men and women whose stories flicker through the record like lamp light over stone. You will walk the corridors of the holy house where isolation did the first half of the work, and watch plazas where the last act ended in ash. You will hear the logic that consoles executioners and the prayers that taught children to applaud. We will not look away from devices. We will refuse to stop at them, because the true engine of this story is not iron or hemp, but the agreement. Quiet, steady, comfortable, between piety and paperwork. If the thought makes your skin tight and good, it should. Terror that wears vestments is harder to recognize and hardest to refuse. But it is not invincible. It must be named in the language it prefers least. The plain inventory of what it does and how it does it. That is the only register strong enough to strip the ritual from the room and leave only a table, a rope, a cloth, a hand, and a pen that will, at last, write what it sees. The Spanish Inquisition did not fall from the sky like some thunderbolt of cruelty. It grew, layer by layer, from older medieval inquisitions, those scattered episcopal courts that sniffed out heresy in patchwork fashion. In France, in Germany, in Italy, bishops and papal envoys had experimented with methods of interrogation. But those were local affairs, small bonfires compared to the blaze that Spain would stoke. What Ferdinand and Isabella built after 1478 was something entirely new. The first national machine of religious terror, welded to the very bones of a rising empire. The timing was no accident. The Reconquista had just drawn to a thunderous close, with Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, collapsing in 1492. Spain was declaring itself not just a kingdom, but a unified Christian state. Into this fragile unity, Pope Sixtus Roman IV issued his papal bull Exigit Sinceri Devotionis, granting the monarchs extraordinary license. Now the Inquisition was not Rome's instrument, it was Spain's. It answered to the crown. That twist of authority mattered. For the first time, torture and terror were being centralized, regulated, and industrialized on behalf of a national project. And at the helm stood Tomás de Torquemada, the Dominican friar who became the first Grand Inquisitor. Torquemada was no improviser. He understood that fear works best when it wears the face of inevitability. Earlier inquisitions had lurched forward case by case, often chaotic. Torquemada built tribunals like branch offices, staffed with clerks, notaries, guards, and confessors who all knew their tasks. Every city, Seville, Toledo, Valencia, soon had its holy house, a node in the network. In less than a decade, Spain had birthed a corporation of terror. Here, the 70% factual skeleton remains. Authorization by papal bull, royal direction, Torquemada's bureaucracy. But now let us add the sinew, the cultural context. Spain in the late 15th century was not only fighting wars, it was fighting anxiety. Jews and Muslims had been present for centuries, their cultures deeply woven into Iberian life. Conversion offered theoretical safety, but suspicion never died. Out of this suspicion bloomed the doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. It was not enough to profess Christianity. One had to prove lineage, to demonstrate untainted ancestry. It was a paranoia dressed up as theology, and the Inquisition became its enforcer. The logic of this new system was as circular as it was lethal. Heresy, they argued, hid beneath masks. To deny accusation was proof of cunning. To confess was proof of guilt. No door open to freedom. The Inquisition perfected what one historian calls the hermeneutics of suspicion. Every gesture could be read as evidence of hidden sin. Did a family light candles on Friday? Jewish. Did they bathe before prayers? Muslim. Did they prosper in trade? Clearly Satan was aiding them. Guilt became a presumption baked into daily life. By the early 1490s, the results spoke in numbers. Over 13,000 cases had already been processed, many ending in flames. Hundreds burned alive, thousands more broken by torture and reconciled through humiliation. The machinery was in motion. When Columbus set sail westward, the Inquisition had already reshaped Spain into a place where faith and fear walked arm in arm, and where entire populations learned that survival meant conformity, silence, and sometimes betrayal. Torquemada's genius, if one dares call it that, was to harness bureaucracy itself as a weapon. Manuals circulated instructing inquisitors in precise methods of questioning. Scribble formulas standardized testimony. Tribunals submitted reports upward, as though heresy could be managed like tax revenues. Fear became predictable, reproducible, exportable, and once bureaucratized, it could be justified. Every act was not the whim of a man but the policy of an institution. It is here that we glimpse the true birth of systematic terror. Not in a dungeon, not in the strike of an executioner's sword, but in the quiet shuffle of paper through corridors. Spain had discovered that cruelty, when wrapped in ritual and legality, could extend beyond moments into centuries. What began as the policing of souls hardened into a mechanism of social control, calibrated with chilling efficiency. And so the stage was set. The victims would be many, the methods gruesome, the theology airtight. But the heart of the horror lay in the design, a kingdom that turned confession into currency and bureaucracy into an iron cage. Spain had found a way to sanctify suffering, and it was only the beginning. The Inquisition's first victims were not exotic outsiders but Spain's own neighbors. The conversos and moriscos who walked the same streets, bought from the same markets, and prayed in the same churches. These were men and women who had already bent under the weight of forced conversions. Jews who had been compelled to accept baptism, Muslims whose mosques had been turned into churches. They thought survival meant embracing the cross. They were wrong. Suspicion followed them like a shadow. The Inquisition taught that no conversion was ever complete, that beneath every prayer lay a secret loyalty to forbidden rites. Lighting candles on a Friday evening, eating food prepared a certain way, whispering a phrase in Arabic, each became a potential indictment. And here lay the trap. There was no way to prove innocence. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you denied, you were guilty of lying. Either way, the tribunal claimed you for its own. This circular logic was not accidental. It was built into the system like a ratchet that turns only one way. Once accused, you could not step backward into freedom. Every question was loaded, every silence suspicious, every protest proof of obstinacy. Innocence was a position that could not exist inside the Inquisition's vocabulary. It was a world where even truth condemned you, and it was efficient. Within the first 2 decades, records show thousands of cases tried. Some historians estimate that by 1492, the year Granada fell and Columbus sailed, over 13,000 trials had already taken place. Hundreds ended in execution, thousands more in forced penance, imprisonment, or confiscation of property. The machinery of guilt was already humming like a well-oiled engine. The details are chilling in their ordinariness. In Seville, a conversa named Beatriz was accused of fasting on Saturdays. Under questioning, she denied it, which made her resistant. After the garrucha dislocated her shoulders, she confessed to observing rituals she had never heard of. The tribunal wrote it down, filed it away, and moved on. Another case closed. Another soul saved. Here is where we must pause to see the broader frame. Spain was not simply enforcing religion, it was engineering identity. The doctrine of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, emerged as a social weapon, dividing old Christians from new. It was not enough to be baptized. Generations had to be cleansed, lineages scrutinized, genealogies policed. In practice, this meant entire families carried invisible brands for centuries. Even children of reconciled heretics found themselves barred from guilds, universities, and public office. The Inquisition's verdicts rippled far beyond the torture chamber. Economics played its quiet role as well. Many conversos were successful merchants, artisans, or financiers. Their prosperity painted targets on their backs. When property was seized, it did not vanish. It flowed into the coffers of the crown, the church, and the inquisitors themselves. Justice, faith, and greed braided together in a knot too strong to untie. One might ask, did no one object? The answer is complicated. Some humanist voices abroad mocked Spain's zeal, and occasionally a bishop protested excess. But within Spain, fear silenced most dissent. The tribunals were designed to terrify not only the accused but the entire community. Public penances, autos da fe and sanbenitos hung in churches made examples of individuals so that everyone else would stay in line. The system worked not because it killed the most people, but because it taught the living to watch themselves, to watch each other, and to whisper denunciations before they themselves could be whispered against. And so the trap tightened. The Inquisition had found its rhythm. Accusation, arrest, torture, confession, penance, or fire, record, repeat. It did not need to catch every heretic. It needed to persuade every citizen that guilt was always one step away, that salvation required submission, and that the tribunal's gaze was everywhere. It is here, in these early years, that we see the essence of the Inquisition revealed. Not in spectacular burnings alone, but in the slow, relentless erosion of trust. Trust in family, trust in neighbors, trust even in one's own memory. It created a society where silence was survival, and where the truth itself was the most dangerous answer you could give. The garrucha, a simple pulley, a rope, and a human body. That was all it took to transform faith into agony. To the inquisitors, it was an opening act, a way to persuade the stubborn into cooperation before more elaborate devices were brought out. To the victims, it was a descent into a private hell, one joint at a time. The procedure was deceptively straightforward. The accused's wrists were bound tightly behind the back. A rope knotted and passed through an iron ring fixed to the ceiling. At a signal, the prisoner was hoisted upward until their feet barely brushed the ground. Sometimes they dangled freely, suspended entirely by their twisted arms. At other times, weights were tied to their ankles to increase the pull. And then nothing. No immediate questions, no violent strikes. Just gravity, cold and relentless, dragging shoulders from sockets while clerks dipped pens into ink. Maria Gonzalez of Seville endured 6 hours of this in 1484. At first, she insisted on her innocence, repeating her prayers in fractured Latin. An hour in, the records note she began to tremble uncontrollably. By the third hour, she begged for mercy. By the sixth, she was confessing to heresy she could not have named the day before. She survived, but her shoulders never healed. For the rest of her life, she could not lift her arms above her waist. To the Inquisition, this was not cruelty. It was evidence that truth had been revealed through necessary persuasion. What made the garrocha so effective was its invisibility. When the victim was finally lowered, their face bore no scars. Their skin showed no burns. To an onlooker, they seemed almost unharmed. Only the twisted shoulders, the trembling hands, the haunted eyes told the truth, and even those could be dismissed. A body without wounds could not accuse its tormentors. In a society that measured justice by what it could see, the garrocha became the perfect tool, agony without evidence. But the cruelty lay not only in the pain, it lay in the rhythm. Victims were often raised and lowered repeatedly, given moments of blessed relief only to be yanked skyward again. Each lowering carried the promise of reprieve. Each hoist shattered it. Hope was dangled as cruelly as the body itself. Inquisitors called this graduated questioning. Victims called it despair. The manuals specified precise steps. Prisoners were to be stripped to undergarments, not for modesty, but so interrogators could observe the twitch of every muscle. Clerks timed the intervals, noting when cries shifted to incoherent babble. Observers studied which angles produced the most rapid confessions. It was pain as experiment, suffering as data. In another world, such precision might have belonged in a physician's notebook. Here, it belonged to men who believed they were physicians of the soul. One merchant, Diego Fernandez, later described the garrocha in words that outlived his torment. It feels as though your arms are being torn from your body while your soul is torn from your arms. He could not decide which was worse, the sensation of joints breaking or the sight of his torturers calmly reading from a document while he dangled above them. They did not rage or gloat. They sipped wine, adjusted candles, exchanged remarks about the weather. His screams were as unremarkable to them as the crackle of logs on the fire. And that was the point. The garrocha was not just a device, it was a performance. The message was clear. Your suffering means nothing to us. Your pain is less important than our paperwork. Even God himself, they implied, looked upon your writhing body and saw not cruelty but purification. The long-term impact of this torture was not measured by the Inquisition scribes, but it is not hard to imagine. Dislocated shoulders meant a lifetime of weakness. Victims could no longer work, lift, or embrace their children. The garrocha crippled not only bodies but futures, binding survivors to poverty and dependence. It stripped away not only dignity in the chamber but self-sufficiency afterward. Yet within the tribunal's walls, this was counted as success. A confession entered the ledger, another soul delivered, another case closed. The rope was coiled neatly, the ink dried, the manual returned to its shelf. Efficiency was preserved. And outside, the plaza bustled, unaware that in a quiet room nearby, a human being had been transformed into a shell of themselves by a rope, a pulley, and the certainty that God approved. If the garrocha tore joints apart with the silent patience of gravity, the Toa invaded something far more primal, the need to breathe. The Inquisition understood that drowning is not just pain. It is terror written into the marrow of every human being. To wield suffocation as a tool was to turn the body's most basic instinct against itself. The method was deceptively simple. A prisoner was strapped to a wooden board inclined just enough so that the head lay lower than the feet. A coarse cloth, the toa, was draped across the face, covering nose and mouth. Then came the water, poured slowly, deliberately, in thin streams that seeped through the fabric, filling mouth and nostrils. Every drop clung to the cloth, transforming breath into a struggle against drowning that never quite arrived. The brilliance, if one dares use that word, lay in its reversibility. Unlike the rack or the burning iron, the toa could be applied and removed again and again. The victim could be pushed to the edge of suffocation, pulled back just long enough to cough and retch, then plunged back into terror. It was a cycle without end, limited only by the patience of the inquisitors. Some victims endured a dozen applications in a single session. Records from 1491 describe the ordeal of Father Antonio Sabrino, accused of secretly observing Jewish rituals. 6 times the cloth was soaked, 6 times he choked and convulsed, his body straining against the straps. By the 3rd application, he was already showing what we now recognize as panic disorder, shaking violently, eyes bulging, unable to form coherent words. The scribes noted these details dispassionately, as if recording the results of a scientific experiment. And in a sense, that is what it was, a laboratory of terror disguised as a tribunal. The Spanish refinements were chilling in their precision. They discovered that lukewarm water was most effective. Cold numbed the skin, hot shocked the system, but lukewarm prolonged the panic. They learned that pouring slowly, drop by drop, triggered more despair than a sudden flood. They calibrated pauses between pourings to intensify anticipation, ensuring that even the moments of silence were laced with dread. For the victims, the agony was not only physical but psychological. The cloth became the world, wet, suffocating, unrelenting. Every instinct screamed for air, yet every attempt to inhale brought only water. Muscles convulsed, lungs burned, bile rose, sometimes vomited and aspirated back into the throat. Many confessed before the cloth was even wet, broken by the mere anticipation of drowning. Others clung to silence until their bodies betrayed them with spasms and incoherent cries. And yet when the session ended, the body often bore no outward sign of torture. The victim might stagger, pale and trembling, but their skin remained unmarked. This was crucial. To the outside world, the Inquisition could present a facade of restraint. How could they be accused of brutality when their prisoners looked physically intact? Behind closed doors, however, men and women carried invisible scars, terror of water, sleepless nights filled with phantom suffocation, trembling hands that could not hold a cup without spilling. Survivors recoiled from fountains, from rain, even from the sound of running water. The world itself became a trigger. One woman, Isabella Santos of Toledo, described her ordeal years later. The cloth becomes your universe. There is no God, no judge, no world, only the burning in your chest and the certainty that you will never breathe again. The worst moment is not the drowning, but the knowing they can begin it all over whenever they please. Her words testify to the genius of cruelty. It was not just drowning without death, but hopelessness without end. The toa demonstrated how the Inquisition had weaponized the body's own biology. They had learned to transform air, the essence of life, into an instrument of domination. To breathe became a privilege granted by one's torturers, revocable at their whim. Few methods so completely embodied the Inquisition's philosophy, that suffering, precisely measured and sanctified, could strip a person not only of resistance, but of their very relationship to life itself. If the Garucha pulled apart shoulders and the Toa taught bodies to betray themselves with air, the Patro was the machine that made pain mathematical. Known in English as the rack, this wooden frame with its ropes and ratchets was no crude medieval relic. In the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, it became an instrument of calculated, almost scientific precision, a device that stretched not only bodies but also the boundaries of what an institution could justify in the name of salvation. Picture it: a prisoner bound flat to a heavy timber table, wrists tied to one end, ankles secured to the other. Between them, a system of rollers and gears waited. At a command, a lever was turned, ropes tightened, the body lengthened by increments so exact that inquisitors could predict which joints would crack on the first turn, which ligaments would strain on the second, which screams would erupt on the third. This was not random brutality, it was choreography. The manuals outlined phases. The primera vuelta, the first turn, was the question, designed to soften resistance. The second produced loud complaints. By the third, dislocations were expected. The scribes often noted them with chilling neutrality, as though marking down weather changes. Beyond the fourth, victims entered what inquisitors clinically called the productive phase, when agony stripped away the last defenses of pride, dignity, or silence. Fernando de la Cruz, a goldsmith from Valencia, endured such a session in 1485. His file describes in careful detail how, after the second turn, he began weeping, but denied the charges. After the third, both shoulders gave way with a sound the clerk recorded as an audible pop. By the fourth, Fernando was naming neighbors, colleagues, even distant cousins, anything to stop the wheel from turning again. His confession became a cascade of accusations, each feeding the machine with new victims. What made the Patro so insidious was its precision. Other tortures could kill too quickly or leave visible damage. The rack allowed for incremental suffering. Each turn could be paused, reversed, or reapplied. Inquisitors often stretched victims just to the brink of unconsciousness, then relaxed the ropes to let them gasp and beg before tightening again. This rhythm of agony and relief was not accidental. It was part of the lesson that hope itself could be weaponized. The device came in sizes tailored to men, women, even children. Adjustments were made for stature and build. Shorter victims required different ratios to achieve maximum effect. Spanish inquisitors were not merely tormentors. They were engineers of suffering, refining a tool until it could be applied with the same efficiency to anyone, anywhere. And they kept records. How many turns until resistance collapsed? How long before sobbing turned to confession? Which body types held out longest, which gave way quickly? Each entry became another data point in an ongoing experiment. This was pain transformed into knowledge, agony reduced to statistics. In modern terms, it was research, except its laboratory was the human body and its findings were broken lives. For the victims, the aftermath was often permanent. Limbs stretched beyond recovery, spines twisted, ligaments torn so badly that walking became impossible. Survivors rarely regained their original height. Their bodies sagged, elongated, alien. Chronic pain haunted them for decades, robbing them of work, family roles, and dignity. One woman, Carmen Delgado, later testified that after the Patro she felt her body had ceased to belong to her. My arms and legs were strangers, speaking only in screams. And yet, to the Inquisition, this was order. The patro was the perfect balance of control, visible enough to terrify those who heard of it, invisible enough in its wounds to preserve the illusion of measured justice. It symbolized the Inquisition's greatest talent, not merely to torture, but to torture with bureaucracy, to transform the chaos of suffering into something legible, recordable, and repeatable. In another world, these same minds might have advanced medicine or mechanics. Instead, their precision was bent toward dismantling the human body piece by piece, turn by turn, in service of a faith that claimed such cruelty was love. The patro stands as a reminder that evil does not always wear a wild face. Sometimes it sits calmly at a wheel, turning slowly, predictably, until the screams become confessions and the ledger is satisfied. If the patro was the grand mechanism of systematic torment, the Inquisition also maintained a whole gallery of what it chillingly called auxiliary methods, tortures that were anything but minor. These were the finishing touches, the improvisations that demonstrated both the creativity and the cruelty of inquisitors. Fire, heat, and iron became their palette, flesh their canvas. The burning cauldron was one such method, and its simplicity masked its terror. Prisoners' feet were forced into iron boots, into which boiling water, oil, or even molten lead could be poured. The boots locked the victim in place, preventing escape while ensuring the liquid penetrated deep into flesh and bone. Different liquids produced different results. Water scalded and blistered, oil burned slower and deeper, molten lead annihilated tissue entirely. Each was chosen deliberately, depending on the desired effect or the stubbornness of the accused. But the boots were only one weapon in this arsenal. Heated irons glowed in braziers, pokers were pressed against skin, and metal plates branded flesh with symbols of alleged heresy. A friar named Miguel de Torres, tried in Seville in 1487, endured what the records blandly called application of heated implements. In reality, it was a sequence of burns delivered with systematic spacing to maximize pain without killing too quickly. His body became a map of deliberate fire, his cries reduced to mere data points in a clerk's neat Latin. Here is where we must pause, for the Inquisition understood something deeper. Terror is not just in the pain, but in the anticipation. Prisoners were forced to watch irons heating in the coals, to hear the hiss as they neared red hot, to smell the acrid tang of burning metal before it ever touched their skin. Many broke before the iron even grazed them. For those who did not, inquisitors perfected graduated torment, touching skin briefly at first, then holding longer, targeting sensitive areas between fingers, behind ears, inside elbows and knees. It was not improvisation. It was anatomy weaponized. The iron boots themselves grew in sophistication. Some were adjustable, tightened gradually around feet and ankles while filled with scalding liquid. Pressure and heat combined, crushing bones even as they seared flesh. Other models were lined with spikes, ensuring that when boiling water was added, wounds multiplied in layers of agony. Spain's craftsmen, once famed for their armor and weapons, turned their ingenuity toward instruments of human unmaking. What made these, lesser, torments uniquely cruel was their unpredictability. Unlike the garrucha or the patro, which followed formal procedures, the use of heated irons or boiling boots was often left to the interrogator's discretion. A victim might think their ordeal finished, only to feel the searing kiss of iron without warning. That uncertainty itself became torture, stretching time into a landscape of perpetual fear. Some sessions combined methods into symphonies of suffering. A prisoner might hang suspended by the garrucha while iron scorched their feet, or be stretched on the potro while burning brands seared joints already wrenched apart. Pain was not merely additive, it was layered, each technique amplifying the others until the victim's body was no longer a single self, but a cacophony of competing agonies. Ana Martinez, a conversa from Cordoba, survived one such ordeal. Records describe full application of auxiliary methods, a phrase that concealed hours of boiling oil, glowing irons, and unpredictable torments. Years later, she said it felt like living in a world made entirely of fire, where every nerve sang in harmony with flames. For her, survival was not relief but sentence. Nightmares of heat haunted her until death. Beyond the chamber, the legacy of these methods lingered. Burned survivors lived with infections that killed slowly, or with nerve damage that turned daily life into a continuation of torture. Some could not sit near hearths, hold warm cups, or endure the summer sun without panic. Heat itself had become a memory, every flicker of flame a ghost of the brazier. And yet within the Inquisition, these torments were treated as administrative details. If the garrucha was a formal question, irons were mere punctuation. Interrogators might order a glowing rod the way one might request more parchment or ink. In this reduction, human agony became just another item in the office's inventory. The auxiliary torments remind us of the Inquisition's essence, cruelty that was both casual and codified. It was not only the great machines of torture that sustained its power, but the small, arbitrary cruelties that made victims live in constant suspense. A man could fear the rack, yes, but he could also fear the hiss of metal, the sight of water simmering in a pot, the footsteps of a guard who might be carrying nothing more than a coal shovel. This was not improvisation. It was artistry of pain, practiced by men who believed they were painting souls clean with fire. And for those who lived through it, the flames never truly went out. What kind of man could light a brazier, hoist a rope, or tighten the potro with steady hands, then kneel in prayer before bed? The psychology of the inquisitors is perhaps the most chilling part of this story. Not because they were monsters, but because they were so ordinary. They were men who had been taught to see torment not as cruelty, but as duty, as love twisted into its cruelest form. Most inquisitors were not brutes dragged from taverns or mercenaries seeking coin. They were university-trained, men of theology and canon law, many fluent in Latin, steeped in scripture. They came from respectable families, received sacraments daily, and often kept reputations as gentle parish priests outside the tribunal walls. To their neighbors, they were not executioners. They were guardians of the faith. How did such men reconcile tearing bodies apart with the gospel of mercy? Through training and a powerful system of institutional conditioning. Novice inquisitors did not begin by branding flesh. They observed. They watched senior officials interrogate, listened to confessions wrung from broken lips, copied neat Latin phrases into the margins of ledgers. Then they assisted, adjusting ropes, holding papers, reading charges. Step by step, cruelty was normalized. By the time they commanded a session themselves, it felt less like horror and more like a sacrament. The language of the institution helped seal the transformation. Victims were never people in the chamber. They were the accused, the subject, the obstinate penitent. Their screams were not cries of pain but signs of resistance. Their broken bodies were instruments of divine correction. With every euphemism, human beings disappeared, replaced by abstractions that absolved the inquisitor of guilt. Letters from Brother Francisco Jimenez, who served in Toledo from 1482 to 1505, illustrate this mindset. Writing to his sister, he described an interrogation not as torment but as persuasion. We questioned a stubborn converso who required extensive persuasion before accepting the grace of confession. The work is difficult but necessary. Each soul saved brings glory to our Lord. For him, the screams were not evidence of cruelty but confirmation of spiritual resistance being broken down. Pain became proof of progress, and the system rewarded such thinking. Effective inquisitors, those who extracted many confessions, received better postings, higher salaries, and greater social prestige. Those who showed mercy were punished, transferred to remote outposts, or quietly removed. Cruelty was not only sanctified, it was incentivized. Some inquisitors even convinced themselves that their victims forced their hand. Father Diego Guerrero's notes from 1489 show him lamenting that a woman's stubbornness grieved him, even as he ordered more heated irons applied. In his mind, she was torturing herself by refusing to confess, and he was merely the instrument of her salvation. To admit otherwise would have meant shattering his identity as a man of God. Yet cracks sometimes appeared. A few inquisitors, years into their service, left letters hinting at nightmares, insomnia, or sudden weeping. Brother Luis de Mercado abandoned his post after 15 years and spent the rest of his life in a monastery, refusing to speak of what he had seen or done. His confessor wrote that Mercado often woke screaming, as though the cries he once ignored had finally claimed him. But such men were exceptions. Most survived by compartmentalizing, living double lives. Gentle confessors in public, meticulous tormentors in private. Father Antonio de Valdez, remembered in Seville as a charitable man who cared for orphans, was the same man who ordered prisoners burned with irons for hours. The paradox is not evidence of duplicity. It is evidence of the human mind's terrifying capacity to divide itself, to justify atrocity as righteousness when framed by authority and faith. This is the darkest revelation of the Inquisition, that its inquisitors were not aberrations, but products of a system that turned ordinary men into instruments of extraordinary cruelty. Give people institutional backing, theological justification, and social reward, and they can convince themselves that breaking bones is saving souls. And that truth should unsettle us, because if it was possible in 15th century Spain, it is possible anywhere authority and belief combine to erase human empathy. The inquisitors did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as servants of God, and that is what makes them so frightening. If torture chambers were the Inquisition's hidden machinery, the auto da fe was its theater, an act of faith turned into mass entertainment, a ritual where suffering became spectacle and entire cities were taught to cheer while their neighbors burned. The phrase itself means act of faith, but the events were as much political theater as they were religious ceremony, carefully choreographed displays of power meant to terrify as much as to purify. Preparation began weeks, sometimes months in advance. Carpentry crews erected towering wooden platforms in central squares, capable of holding thousands of onlookers. Banners of the church and the crown fluttered side by side. Priests rehearsed prayers, choirs practiced hymns. Costumes were prepared for the condemned. The infamous San Benito yellow penitential robes painted with flames, devils, or crosses depending on the supposed crime. The coroza, tall pointed hats, made prisoners visible from far away, marking them as both heretics and cautionary tales. Nothing was improvised. Every detail was designed to impress upon the public that the Inquisition's reach was total and its justice inescapable. On the day itself, the condemned were paraded through the streets, barefoot, clutching candles, jeered at by crowds that hurled refuse and insults. Some wore gags to prevent them from proclaiming innocence or prayers in their native tongues. Street criers announced their names and alleged crimes, ensuring that reputations and families were ruined before the flames were ever lit. This humiliation was not incidental. It was the opening act, a communal unmasking where shame began its work before pain followed. Then came the spectacle itself. One of the most infamous autos da fe took place in Madrid in 1680. King Carlos Roman II and his court attended in person, seated in ornate stands beneath silken canopies, while more than 30,000 citizens crowded into temporary amphitheaters. Vendors hawked roasted nuts and sweet wine. Children clapped as the condemned shuffled past, their fates already sealed. For the crowd, it was both carnival and catechism, entertainment that doubled as moral lesson. The trials were read aloud in excruciating detail. Accusations of secret Jewish rituals, Muslim prayers whispered at night, books owned or words spoken that hinted of heresy. Nothing was too small to parade as proof. Even intimate family details were broadcast, transforming private life into public humiliation. Some were sentenced to public penance, others to exile, still others to death by fire. And here the Inquisition added its cruelest flourish, the false hope of mercy. Those who confessed at the last moment might be strangled before the fire touched them, spared the agony of burning alive. Those who held firm, proclaiming innocence or loyalty to their outlawed faith, were bound to stakes, wood piled around their feet. Inquisitors experimented even here. Green wood smoldered, producing smoke that suffocated slowly, while dry wood blazed hot and fast. Death was a variable, adjusted like a stage effect. Eyewitnesses describe crowds gasping, laughing, even cheering as the fires roared. One woman, Catalina de Auso, wrote bitterly that children played games between executions, while priests blessed the flames as if they were holy water. The burning of human beings became part prayer meeting, part festival. Spain had turned killing into liturgy, teaching an entire society that violence in God's name was not only acceptable but sacred. When the fires died, the cruelty did not end. Ashes were scattered to prevent martyrdom. Names of the condemned were etched into church walls, reminders of disgrace that haunted families for generations. Survivors of penance wore their San Benitos for years, living emblems of shame. Even the wood used for burning was often charged to the victim's family, forcing them to finance their own loved one's destruction. The genius of the auto da fe was not in the deaths themselves. It was in the lesson burned into every witness's memory. Anyone could be next. Anyone could be denounced, paraded, humiliated, consumed in fire while their neighbors ate chestnuts and sipped wine. The spectacle was a warning writ in flames: obedience or annihilation. This is what made the auto da fe more terrifying than the torture chamber. Torture destroyed individuals. The public ritual destroyed communities, weaving fear into the fabric of civic life. The Inquisition understood that cruelty done in secret frightens the few, but cruelty done in public terrifies the many. And so, the act of faith became an act of control, a theater where the script never changed, but the audience never stopped watching. If the auto da fe was the Inquisition's grand public theater, the San Benito was its lingering curse, a punishment that clung not only to the condemned but to their descendants. On its surface, the San Benito seemed simple, a coarse yellow tunic painted with flames, demons, or crosses. But this garment was far more than clothing. It was a portable monument to shame, a walking billboard that announced a person's spiritual crime to the world. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. Flames painted upward meant the wearer had confessed and been reconciled to the church. Flames painted downward meant death awaited them. Devils signified especially grave offenses against the faith. The tunic transformed human beings into symbols, stripping them of individuality and marking them as permanent outsiders. And the punishment did not end when the robe was removed. After sentencing, San Benitos were often hung in local churches, inscribed with the name of the condemned. Families would attend Mass each week beneath the garment that immortalized their disgrace. Generations of children grew up in towns where their ancestors' shame was literally nailed to sacred walls. In Seville, some San Benitos hung for over a century, turning family names into curses that no one could escape. The social consequences were devastating. Merchants who wore the San Benito could no longer find customers. Neighbors refused to speak to them. Their children were forbidden from joining guilds or attending universities. Marriages collapsed under the weight of disgrace. It was, in effect, a sentence of social death, a punishment that destroyed not the body but the bonds of community that made life livable. Consider the case of Maria Delgado. Accused of secretly practicing Jewish rituals, she was sentenced to wear the San Benito for 2 years. When her punishment ended, the robe bearing her name was displayed in Seville Cathedral. For over 100 years it hung there, condemning not only her but her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Entire branches of her family were barred from respectable marriages, driven into poverty, and treated as permanent outcasts. A single accusation had cursed bloodlines for generations. What made this system so effective was its infectiousness. Shame spread like a plague. Business partners, distant relatives, even casual acquaintances of a San Benito wearer often faced suspicion. The garment made heresy contagious in the eyes of society, ensuring that entire networks of people were pulled into the spiral of disgrace. The Spanish even refined the designs regionally, developing codes that locals could read at a glance. Some robes bore painted portraits of the condemned being burned, ensuring that humiliation was not only remembered but visually reenacted whenever the garment was displayed. Others carried calligraphic inscriptions detailing the specific heresy, transforming the robe into a permanent legal indictment. Perhaps most chilling of all was the way this punishment weaponized communities against themselves. by forcing neighbors to shun, gossip about, and ostracize those marked by the San Benito. The Inquisition decentralized its cruelty. Ordinary citizens became the enforcers, carrying forward the punishment long after the official sentence had ended. The psychological toll was immense. Victims described feeling as though the robe fused with their skin, even when removed. Fernando Rodriguez, condemned in Cordoba, wrote bitterly that the robe becomes a ghost that follows you everywhere. People see it even when it is not there. The robe may have been coarse cloth, but its weight was heavier than iron. In some ways, the San Benito was more feared than execution. Death, at least, brought finality. The robe promised endless exile in the land of the living, a punishment that infected one's children and grandchildren, ensuring that disgrace became hereditary. It was a weapon not of torture or fire, but of memory. And memory, once institutionalized, can be deadlier than flame. The Inquisition, always precise in its cruelty, had perfected a form of punishment that did not require racks or cauldrons. It required only fabric, paint, and the human tendency to gossip and ostracize. Through the San Benito, they discovered how to transform entire communities into collaborators, ensuring that torture extended beyond the chamber, beyond the grave, and into the daily lives of those who bore the mark of shame. If the San Benito inflicted a slow death of shame, the Casa Santa, the Holy House, delivered something even darker, a world where hope itself was dismantled brick by brick. These were not ordinary prisons. They were carefully engineered psychological laboratories of despair, designed to break people before a single lash or iron was applied. Survivors did not call them holy. They called them houses where hope went to die. From the moment a prisoner crossed the threshold, the architecture declared domination. Massive iron-studded doors shut with a weight that reverberated through the bones. Narrow corridors wound like a maze, deliberately confusing, so no one could keep track of direction or distance. Cells were small, no larger than a cupboard, and calculated to deny comfort. Too short to stand upright, too narrow to stretch out fully, too low to breathe easily. Every choice was measured to grind down the spirit. Light was its own form of torment. No cell saw sunlight. Instead, oil lamps cast erratic shadows across rough stone, creating grotesque patterns that seemed to move when the prisoner's eyes closed in exhaustion. In darkness, imagination became an executioner. Many swore they saw figures shifting in corners or devils crawling along the walls. The mind, deprived of time and rhythm, began to invent horrors where none were needed. Sound, too, was weaponized. Screams from interrogation rooms carried deliberately through stone corridors, echoing in ways that made it impossible to tell how close or far the suffering was. Keys clanked. Doors slammed. Guards stomped their boots at odd hours, jolting captives awake. And then silence. A silence so complete it pressed against the ears until the absence of sound itself became unbearable. Food was never about nourishment. It was about weakening without killing. Thin gruel, stale bread, and dirty water kept prisoners alive just enough to ensure they could still be tortured later. Hunger became a constant companion, a gnawing reminder that the body could not be trusted. Hygiene was ignored. Buckets overflowed. Vermin thrived. The message was clear. You were no longer fully human. Then came the false kindness, a calculated cruelty. A guard might slip an extra crust of bread or pause to exchange a few words, A scribe might smile gently before recording an interrogation. These gestures were not mercies. They were manipulations designed to create dependence. Prisoners began to crave approval from the very men who were dismantling their lives, a dependency that made resistance seem pointless. Most devastating was the anticipation. Many prisoners were not tortured immediately. Instead, they were left to stew in the Casa Santas for weeks, sometimes months, waiting for the summons to the chamber they could hear but not see. The imagination filled in the gaps. Survivors often admitted that by the time they were finally dragged before an inquisitor, they felt relief. Relief to finally face pain because the waiting had become a torture all its own. Brother Miguel de Carbajal, who survived 3 months in Seville's Casa Santa, described it best. The walls pressed closer every day. The shadows moved when I blinked. The screams never stopped, though sometimes I wondered if they came from my own mind. When they finally came for me, I thanked them for ending the waiting. His words reveal the Inquisition's genius. The Casa Santa itself was a weapon, a slow bleed of hope that ensured by the time the racks or irons were employed, resistance had already collapsed. Inquisitors understood that broken bodies could still resist, but broken minds rarely did. That was the purpose of the Holy House, to dissolve identity, shred dignity, and cultivate despair, until confession seemed not only inevitable but desirable. By the time torture officially began, most prisoners were already half destroyed. Their wills surrendered to the silence, the shadows, and the endless, suffocating wait. Perhaps the most chilling truth of the Inquisition was this: many of its victims were entirely innocent. They were not heretics, not rebels, not secret worshippers of forbidden faiths. They were ordinary people, tailors, seamstresses, merchants, widows, whose lives were destroyed not because of what they had done, but because of what others whispered. The Inquisition thrived on accusation, and accusation itself was enough to end a life. Anonymous denunciations were not only permitted but actively encouraged. A neighbor with a grudge, a rival seeking advantage, a jealous lover, all could tip the balance of fate with a single murmur. Lighting a candle on a Friday evening, refusing a piece of pork at dinner, owning a suspicious book, these were enough to arouse suspicion. Once suspicion began, it rarely ended in acquittal. The machinery demanded victims. The logic was a trap with no escape. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you protested innocence, you were lying, therefore guilty. Even silence condemned you, for why would an innocent soul not cry out its purity? Under such rules, truth became irrelevant. Innocence itself was transformed into evidence of deception. Consider the case of Maria Santos, a Catholic seamstress from Valencia. Her only crime was working late into the night with candles. A rival tailor accused her of observing Jewish rituals. She denied it, of course, but her denial only confirmed her stubbornness. She was tortured until she confessed to practices she had never even heard of. Her shop was seized, her family ruined, her name forever blackened. All because one competitor wanted her gone. Or Pedro Hernandez, a bookkeeper from Seville. Tortured on the potro until his joints cracked, he eventually confessed to following Jewish dietary laws. The irony: he had eaten pork the very day before his arrest. But agony does not care for irony. He would have confessed to being Satan himself if it meant the turning of the wheel would stop. His confession, worthless and false, became official truth. This system fed on itself, growing like a wildfire. One confession led to another, for victims under torture often named friends, relatives, or business partners just to end their pain. These names sparked fresh arrests, new confessions, more torture. Entire neighborhoods could be consumed in what inquisitors chillingly called reconciliation cascades. The Benitez family of Granada is one such example. A single accusation against the patriarch led to torture, which led to him naming his wife, who then named their children, who in turn named cousins, friends, and in-laws. Within 2 years, nearly 50 people had been arrested, tortured, and punished. The original accusation, later revealed, was nothing more than a property dispute with a neighbor. The Inquisition didn't care. The machine needed fuel, and the Benitez family became its firewood. Perhaps most tragic were the innocents who had no framework to understand their suffering. Guilty prisoners, at least, could rationalize their pain as punishment for hidden sins. But the innocent were thrown into a void. Catalina Morales, tortured in 1487, wrote afterward, "The guilty man knows why he suffers. The innocent knows nothing, and so believes that God himself has abandoned them. To endure torment without reason was to endure despair beyond comprehension." The Inquisition did not stop at individuals. It devoured itself. Inquisitors who showed mercy were denounced by rivals as sympathizers. Scribes who hesitated to record confessions were accused of secret loyalties. Even Grand Inquisitors occasionally faced suspicion from within. Once unleashed, the machinery of fear could not distinguish between guilty and innocent. It consumed all who stood too near. This, perhaps, is the most terrifying legacy of the Inquisition. It proved that when institutions weaponize suspicion, no one is safe. Innocence becomes not a shield, but a liability. Truth itself is irrelevant, and entire communities can be annihilated not by armies, but by whispers. If the suffering of adults was unbearable, what the Inquisition did to children plunges us into an even darker abyss. One might imagine that innocence, youth, or helplessness would shield the youngest from the cruelty of the Holy Office. In reality, children were not spared. They were folded into the system with the same ruthless efficiency as their parents. The legal framework was precise. Children as young as 12 could be tried for heresy. Between 12 and 14, they faced reduced sentences that still included imprisonment, humiliation, and even torture. At 14, they were treated as adults, their small bodies subjected to racks, irons, and fire like anyone else. But the horror began much earlier, in ways more insidious than physical pain. When parents were accused, children were often seized and placed into Inquisition custody. These were not orphanages in any merciful sense. They were indoctrination centers. In Seville's Casa de los Niños, over 200 children lived after their parents had been executed or imprisoned. They were given new names to sever family ties, drilled daily in Catholic prayers, and interrogated regularly about supposed heretical practices at home. They were taught that their own parents had deserved death, and that by denouncing them, they were serving God. Some children were forced to watch their parents' torture or execution. Imagine an 8-year-old girl gagging on the smoke of an auto da fe, watching her mother burn while priests whispered that this was divine justice. Imagine a boy of 12 seeing his father's arms wrenched from their sockets, told that this was proof of sin. The cruelty was not accidental, it was deliberate. By making children witnesses, the Inquisition multiplied the reach of its terror across generations. They even weaponized children as accusers because their innocence supposedly made them incapable of deception. Testimony from the young carried enormous weight. Terrified boys and girls, eager to please their captors or avoid punishment themselves, repeated what inquisitors taught them to say. Their words became evidence against their own families. In 1491, 8-year-old Isabella Mendes testified that her mother lit candles on Fridays and refused pork. She had no understanding of Jewish ritual. She was parroting scripts fed to her. Her testimony condemned her mother to death. Isabella was then raised in an Inquisition institution, taught to view her role not as betrayal but as righteousness. Even torture was adjusted for children. The garrucha was used with lighter weights, the toca with less water-heated irons at lower temperatures, enough to sear terror into their minds without killing them outright. Parents were sometimes forced to watch their children suffer, a torment so unbearable that many confessed to anything demanded just to stop the cries. Likewise, children broke quickly when made to witness their parents' agony. The family bond, turned inside out, became one of the Inquisition's most effective weapons. The case of the Ramires family from Toledo illustrates this horror. Arrested together in 1489, the 12-year-old son Miguel resisted at first. But after hours of seeing his father dangling from the garrucha and his mother choking under the cloth of the toca, Miguel broke. He confessed to elaborate heretical practices he could not possibly have known, implicating his parents with details fed to him by interrogators. His words sealed their deaths. He survived, but lived the rest of his life with the unbearable knowledge that he had condemned his own family. Children raised within Inquisition custody often emerged psychologically shattered. Many developed chronic anxiety, attachment disorders, and obsessive obedience to authority. Some became informants as adults, turning against neighbors in a desperate attempt to prove loyalty. Others, unable to form stable families, carried the trauma into the next generation, perpetuating cycles of fear and mistrust. There was also profit hidden in this cruelty. When parents were executed, their property was confiscated, but their children became a financial burden. The solution was pragmatic. Children were assigned to institutions that received royal funding per head, turning orphans into revenue streams. Some were given as domestic servants to loyal Catholic families, effectively sold into indentured servitude. The system was efficient, profitable, and monstrous. Perhaps the most terrifying lesson is this: the Inquisition understood that to destroy heresy, one must destroy the seed. By targeting children, they didn't just punish the present, they poisoned the future. Faith was not merely enforced through fire and iron, but etched into the minds of the young through terror, shame, and betrayal. The institution had found a way to torture memory itself, ensuring that even after the flames died, its fear lived on in those too small to resist. Of all the lies told by the Inquisition, none was crueler than the promise of mercy through confession. Prisoners were told again and again, "Admit your sins, repent, and the Church will forgive you." But in truth, confession was not a path to freedom. It was the tightening of the noose. The act meant to save the soul became the very instrument of damnation. The process was designed as a trap. A prisoner might first be asked to admit guilt in broad terms. Yes, they had lapsed in faith. Yes, they had strayed, but that was never enough. Interrogators demanded specifics. Names of accomplices, places of secret gatherings, details of rituals. The more one confessed, the more questions followed. Each answer generated another demand, another accusation. Confession was not a conclusion, it was an endless spiral. Take the case of Francisco Delgado, tortured in 1486. After hours on the potro, he confessed to avoiding pork, observing the Sabbath, and praying in secret. He named a dozen fellow conversos. He begged for mercy. Yet despite his cooperation, he was burned alive, his own words used as proof against him. His confession did not spare him, it sealed him. The Inquisition categorized confessions with bureaucratic precision. A spontaneous confession might earn imprisonment, property confiscation, or public penance. A confession extracted under torture could still result in execution, justified by claiming that God's truth had emerged through pain. A relapsed confession, admitting heresy once, then being accused again later, was considered the gravest sin of all, punishable only by fire. The rules shifted like sand, ensuring that no prisoner could ever truly escape. Worse still was the doctrine of incomplete confession. If inquisitors believed a prisoner was holding anything back, no matter how trivial, they declared the entire confession void. Torture resumed until the victim supplied details that matched the inquisitors' expectations. This meant even total honesty could be reinterpreted as deceit. One widow from Toledo, Ana Rodriguez, confessed to practicing Jewish rituals. When she named 3 fellow heretics, the inquisitors insisted she was protecting others. Under renewed torture, she named more names, some fabricated, some innocent neighbors she dragged into her nightmare. Now she was guilty not only of heresy but of false accusation. Either way, the flames awaited. Even those who cooperated fully were rarely spared humiliation. Some were paraded in public reconciliation ceremonies, forced to wear sanbenitos and confess before crowds. The church presented these rituals as merciful, welcoming sinners back into the fold. But in truth, they were spectacles of degradation. Families were marked permanently, their names tied to disgrace long after the victim's death. For the few who truly believed confession would save them, the psychological torment was profound. Survivors struggled with crushing guilt, having betrayed loved ones under duress. Many could no longer distinguish between truth and the lies they had confessed. Some were haunted by their own words, convinced that by speaking them, they had damned themselves regardless of the torturer's hand. The Inquisition even weaponized mercy itself as propaganda. On rare occasions, a prisoner who confessed swiftly and implicated others might be spared burning. These exceptions were publicized widely, held up as proof of the church's kindness. But they were carefully chosen cases, designed not to show compassion but to encourage others to confess. The hope of mercy was a baited hook, and once swallowed, escape was impossible. Ultimately, confession meant only one thing: the victim had been broken. The inquisitors had succeeded in making the prisoner complicit in their own destruction. The torturer's hands could remain ceremonially clean, for the victim's own words had condemned them. That was the final cruelty. The Inquisition did not simply kill the body. It forced the victim to dig their own grave with words, and then declared the burial an act of grace. Behind the incense, the prayers, and the proclamations of holy duty, the Inquisition hid a truth as old as power itself. Money moved the gears. The institution draped itself in theology, but at its core, It was also a machine for systematic theft, a grand enterprise of plunder disguised as piety. The economic design was simple and devastating. From the moment someone was accused, their property was seized for safekeeping. If found guilty, which in over 95% of cases they were, their estate was absorbed into the Inquisition's coffers. If executed, their goods became permanent revenue for church and crown alike. Even those who survived with reconciliation were often crushed under ruinous fines that stripped them of all security. The monarchy profited directly. Ferdinand and Isabella did not merely permit the Inquisition. They bankrolled it because it paid them back. Every heretic's property helped fill the treasury, funding wars, palaces, and voyages of exploration. Historians now estimate that confiscated wealth in modern terms reached the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. Columbus's voyages to the New World, in part, were financed by the estates of accused conversos. The conquest of Granada, the final victory over Muslim Spain, was fueled by the gold and land stripped from alleged heretics. Target selection followed this logic. Those most at risk were not the poorest peasants but the prosperous: merchants, bankers, artisans. The conversos and moriscos, Jewish and Muslim converts, were particularly vulnerable, not only because their loyalty was suspect, but because they owned property worth taking. It was no coincidence that families with houses in central squares, ships in harbor, or wealth in trade routes so often found themselves under scrutiny. Abraham Sr., one of Castile's wealthiest converts, endured exactly this fate. Arrested in 1491, he was tortured until he confessed. His 17 properties, 3 merchant ships, and financial holdings were all seized and redistributed. His wealth bankrolled Inquisition operations for years. His fall was not about faith, it was about capital. The theft was not chaotic but systematic. Assets were cataloged by professional clerks. Auction houses sold confiscated goods, often at prices deliberately undervalued so officials or their allies could buy them cheaply. Corruption thrived. Inquisitors enriched themselves by channeling confiscated estates into the hands of relatives. Informants were rewarded with shares of seized property, giving ordinary citizens incentive to denounce their wealthier neighbors. Betrayal became profitable. The consequences rippled across Spain. Skilled artisans, merchants, and financiers, the very backbone of commerce, were gutted. Fear of attracting suspicion stifled innovation. Prosperity itself became dangerous. To be visibly successful was to court envy, and with it, the possibility of denunciation. In time, Spain's commercial class withered. Other European nations surged ahead in trade, finance, and invention, while Spain, flush with stolen wealth but hollowed of talent, sank slowly into economic stagnation. Perhaps the most cynical aspect of all was the theological justification for this plunder. The Church argued that heretics had forfeited the right to property, since their souls belonged to Satan. Confiscation was framed as cleansing, an act of mercy that stripped them of material corruption. In sermons, priests claimed that the wealth of heretics was poisoned, and its transfer to church and crown sanctified it for holy use. Theft became salvation, plunder became purification. Through the wealth motive, the mask slipped. The Inquisition was not just a tribunal of faith, it was an engine of exploitation. Every scream in the torture chamber echoed in royal vaults. Every flame of the auto-da-fe lit gold into the crown's treasury. Every ruined family funded expansion, conquest, and empire. The souls of Spain's victims were not the only thing consumed in the fires. Their homes, their fields, their livelihoods all were turned to ash, and from that ash rose cathedrals, ships, and armies. This was not accidental cruelty. It was structured, incentivized, and rewarded. The Inquisition discovered that nothing binds an institution more tightly to brutality than profit. And so the suffering of thousands became a ledger entry, the breaking of bodies a balance sheet, the annihilation of lives a lucrative business dressed in holy robes. The Inquisition did not end with a thunderclap of justice or a sudden awakening of conscience. It died slowly, quietly, fading like a shadow at dusk, while its architects worked feverishly to bury the evidence of what they had done. The cover-up was almost as systematic as the torture had been. By the late 18th century, Spain had become an object of ridicule across Europe. Enlightenment thinkers mocked it as a land shackled to medieval superstition, still burning people alive in an age of telescopes and revolutions. The Spanish crown, now embarrassed rather than proud of its tribunal, began to retreat, but not openly. They trimmed its claws while preserving its form, hoping to silence criticism without ever admitting wrongdoing. The last known execution came in 1826. A humble schoolmaster, Cayetano Ripoll, hanged for teaching deist principles. His death looked almost anticlimactic compared to the roaring pyres of centuries earlier, but it revealed how deeply the system clung to life. Even in its final moments, it still chose death over tolerance. Meanwhile, a great purge was underway, not of people, but of paper. Archives were combed, ledgers scrutinized, and then the bonfires were lit again, this time for parchment instead of flesh. Torture records, financial inventories of confiscated estates, transcripts of confessions, thousands of documents vanished into smoke. The intent was clear: erase the ledger of cruelty, cleanse the record as they once claimed to cleanse souls. Yet here, the Inquisition betrayed itself by its very efficiency. It had always been a bureaucracy of pain obsessed with detail. Too much detail to destroy it all. Fragments survived, hidden in provincial offices, misplaced in church vaults, forgotten in dusty storage. These remnants now speak louder than all the propaganda written to obscure them. In the Suprema archives, historians have uncovered performance reports on inquisitors, data sheets tallying cases and confession productivity, even notes comparing the efficiency of one torture method to another. The language of faith had concealed a cold science of suffering. And still, the cover-up continued long after abolition. In 19th century Spain, textbooks described the Inquisition as relatively humane compared to secular courts. Officials insisted that most trials ended with minor penances. Priests framed the institution as a regrettable but necessary defense against chaos. Abroad, apologists whispered that tales of cruelty were Protestant exaggerations, propaganda designed to slander Catholic Spain. For a time, these stories worked. Generations grew up with a sanitized vision, an inquisition of stern priests and misguided zeal, not racks and flames. But history has a way of clawing back the truth. In 2019, during renovations of the former Inquisition headquarters in Seville, workers uncovered a sealed chamber containing torture devices and human remains, hidden away during the final years of the tribunal. The bones bore marks consistent with torture, confirming what apologists had long denied. No Protestant pen had invented these scars. They were carved by Spanish steel into Spanish flesh. Perhaps most unsettling is how the method survived, even after the institution was gone. During the Spanish Civil War, Franco's regime consulted Inquisition records, drawing lessons on interrogation and psychological pressure. Techniques refined in the 15th century echoed into the 20th, proof that cruelty, once systematized, rarely dies. It lingers in archives, in training manuals, in the memory of institutions that learned to wield fear as power. When the Inquisition was officially abolished in 1834, there was no reckoning, no national confession of guilt. There was only silence, and silence itself became complicity. Spain turned the page without reading it, leaving the stains to seep through the centuries. And so, for many, the Inquisition became not a cautionary tale, but a hazy rumor, a half-remembered shadow. The cover-up succeeded in one sense. Millions today think of the Inquisition as distant exaggeration, a dark legend rather than a measured system of cruelty. But the fragments that remain tell the truth clearly. For over 3 centuries, Spain operated one of the most sophisticated machines of terror the world has ever seen. And when it finally stopped, it tried to erase not just bodies but memory itself. That perhaps is the most frightening lesson. Atrocities can be committed in daylight, with papal blessing and royal approval. And when the fires are extinguished, the record can be rewritten until the crime itself feels like myth. The Spanish Inquisition officially ended in 1834, but its legacy of sanctioned suffering endures like a scar across history. What made it so terrifying was not only the scale of its cruelty, but the lessons it taught about human nature, bureaucracy, and power. Lessons that echo far beyond the plazas of Madrid or the cells of Seville. At its heart, the Inquisition proved that ordinary men can become executioners when institutions sanctify their violence. Inquisitors were not born monsters. They were educated clerics, theologians, men of prayer. They ate dinners with their families, wrote letters to loved ones, prayed for mercy, and by morning, tightened ropes, lit fires, and shattered bodies. The transformation was not individual but systemic. When a church declared cruelty a form of love, when a crown declared torture an act of justice, when a bureaucracy provided manuals and procedures, ordinary men found themselves committing extraordinary evil with a clear conscience. Equally chilling was the bureaucracy of pain. The Inquisition reduced suffering to paperwork. Screams became data points. Tortures were recorded, calibrated, optimized like machinery. A confession under the garrucha was timed to the hour. A false admission under the toga was noted in margins with clinical precision. Agony became a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet became a weapon. In this way, cruelty lost its moral weight and became routine administration. It was not barbarism, it was office work. And then there was the bystander effect. For over 3 centuries, millions of Spaniards lived under the shadow of the Inquisition. They saw neighbors marched in San Benitos, watched friends paraded through the streets, heard screams from behind stone walls, and yet they adapted. They attended autos da fe as if they were festivals, cheering while flames consumed flesh. They shunned families marked with disgrace, taught their children to point and whisper. Fear played its role, yes, but fear alone does not explain 300 years of complicity. The Inquisition succeeded because ordinary people accepted its rules, convinced themselves its cruelty was necessary, and allowed horror to become habit. This is perhaps the most dangerous inheritance. The Inquisition revealed that any society, given the right combination of fear, authority, and ideology, can normalize the unthinkable. When people believe their suffering serves a higher cause, God, nation, security, they will not only permit cruelty but participate in it. The Spanish Inquisition is not just a historical event. It is a mirror, reflecting what humans are capable of when convinced that righteousness requires brutality. Its methods, too, survived. The idea that anticipation amplifies pain, that isolation breaks resistance, that hope followed by despair destroys the spirit. These were not forgotten with abolition. Totalitarian regimes of the 20th century studied them, refined them, applied them to political prisoners. Techniques born in stone chambers beneath cathedrals resurfaced in secret police basements centuries later. The manuals of the Inquisition became silent textbooks for modern state terror. And what of the victims? Their screams have long since faded, their ashes scattered, yet their warning remains. Beware any institution that claims unlimited power to inflict suffering in the name of unlimited good. Beware the theology, ideology, or bureaucracy that tells you pain is salvation, cruelty is mercy, and silence is safety. The Spanish Inquisition's greatest crime was not only the murder of thousands, nor the torture of tens of thousands more. Its greatest crime was the proof it offered humanity, that evil does not require demons, only men with pens, robes, and authority. That entire societies can participate in atrocity, not by accident but by ritual, belief, and habit. That history's darkest chambers are not relics of the past, but warnings for the future. The final lesson is as urgent now as it was then. The capacity for systematic cruelty sleeps in every society. It waits for fear to awaken it, for authority to sanction it, for ordinary people to normalize it. The fires of the auto da fe may be long extinguished, but the machinery of the Inquisition, the psychology, the bureaucracy, the obedience, remains very much alive, ready to rise wherever fear and faith outstrip compassion and conscience.